January 27, 1945, minus 15 degrees Celsius on the frozen plains of western Poland. Through the morning mist rolling across the Vistula River, Soviet tank commander Senior Lieutenant Ivan Moroz could see them clearly through his commander's cupola. 5 German Panther tanks, their distinctive sloped armour unmistakable even at 1 to 200 metres, hull down behind a railway embankment near the village of Lissau. The Panthers belonged to the 16th Panzer Division, veterans of 3 years of Eastern Front combat who had learned to respect Soviet armour the hard way. But what they were about to face was something entirely new in their experience. Moroz's tank was an IS-2 model, 1944, the Joseph Stalin heavy tank, 46 tons of Soviet engineering that had arrived at the front just 3 months earlier. Its 122mm D-25T gun, the most powerful tank weapon deployed by any army in World War II, was loaded with an armour-piercing round that weighed 25 kilograms. The German crews, experienced tankers who had faced T-34s and KV-1s across countless battlefields, had no idea what was coming. Within the next 8 minutes, all 5 Panthers would be destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled, but utterly annihilated in a demonstration of firepower that would terrify German armoured forces for the rest of the war. This is the story of how Soviet heavy industry and brutal battlefield experience combined to create a tank that could punch through the frontal armour of any German vehicle at ranges German gunners thought were safe. It's about the moment when German armoured superiority, carefully cultivated since 1941, met a weapon that rendered their tactical advantages meaningless. The IS-2's development began with blood and failure. In July 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, Soviet tank crews discovered that their existing heavy tanks, the KV-1 and early KV-85 models, were hopelessly outmatched by the new German Panthers and Tigers. The 85mm guns that had seemed adequate against earlier Panzers bounced harmlessly off the thick frontal armour of these new German tanks. Soviet crews were dying in burning metal coffins, unable to penetrate their enemies while being torn apart by German 75 and 88mm guns. The KV-1, which had terrorised German troops in 1941 when its armour was impervious to most German weapons, was now a death trap. Slow, unreliable and undergunned, it could neither penetrate German heavy tanks nor escape from them. Lieutenant General Yakov Nikolaevich Fedorenko, head of the Red Army's tank forces, submitted an urgent report to Stalin in August 1943. The document, preserved in Soviet archives, was brutally honest. Our heavy tanks are obsolete. The KV series cannot fulfill its role against new German armour. We require a vehicle with sufficient firepower to destroy Panthers and Tigers at standard combat ranges, and sufficient armour to survive their return fire. Current vehicles possess neither quality. Our crews are being slaughtered. Stalin's response was characteristically blunt. Design a tank that can kill Panthers, or design your own coffins. The engineers will have whatever resources they require. Failure is not acceptable. The development of what would become the IS-2 fell to the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, known as Tankergrad, the tank city. This massive industrial complex in the Urals had been evacuated from Leningrad in 1941 and rebuilt into the largest tank production facility in the world. Its chief designer, Nikolai Leonidovich Dukov, had been working on a successor to the KV series since early 1943. Dukov's team faced a fundamental problem. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized mass production, reliability, and ease of operation. The Red Army needed thousands of tanks, operated by crews with minimal training, that could be produced by workers who had never seen a factory before the war. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger represented a different philosophy, complex, sophisticated, requiring skilled crews and precision manufacturing. The Germans could afford this approach because they were fighting a defensive war by 1943. They could produce smaller numbers of superior tanks and use them to defend prepared positions. The Soviets, advancing across thousands of kilometers of territory, needed tanks that could be produced in overwhelming numbers and survive the brutal conditions of mobile warfare. The solution Dukov proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Take the proven chassis and transmission of the KV-85, upgun it dramatically with a weapon capable of destroying any German tank, and optimize the armor layout for frontal protection, while accepting vulnerability from the sides and rear. The result would be a breakthrough tank, designed to smash through German defences in the initial assault, not to engage in prolonged combat. The weapon Dukov selected was revolutionary. The 122mm D25T gun was a modified version of the A-19 Core artillery piece, a field gun designed to destroy bunkers and strongpoints. It had never been intended for tank use, and adapting it required solving problems no one had previously attempted. The gun was massive, over 6 meters long, weighing 2,500 kilograms. Installing it in a tank turret required a complete redesign of the turret itself. The recoil forces were tremendous, requiring a sophisticated hydraulic recoil system and a massive counterweight in the turret rear. The size of the breech mechanism meant that ammunition had to be loaded in 2 pieces, propellant charge first, then the projectile itself. This slowed the rate of fire dramatically. Where a German Panther could fire 8 to 10 aimed shots per minute, the IS-2 could manage only 2 to 3. But what the IS-2 lacked in rate of fire, it compensated for in devastating power. The armour-piercing round, designated BR-471, was unlike anything in the German arsenal. Weighing 25 kilograms, travelling at 780 meters per second, it carried kinetic energy equivalent to 7,500 kilojoules at the muzzle. For comparison, the German Panther's 75mm gun generated roughly 3,000 kilojoules. The IS-2's shell carried more than twice the energy. The high-explosive round, OF-471, was even more impressive. Weighing 25 kilograms with a bursting charge of 3.6 kilograms of TNT, it was essentially an artillery shell. Against soft targets, fortifications, or even the side armour of tanks, the high-explosive round didn't need to penetrate. The blast effect alone could kill crews through overpressure, blow tracks off, or destroy external equipment. The first IS-2 prototypes completed testing in October 1943. The test reports, preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk, documented both the tank's capabilities and its limitations. During firing trials at the Kubinka Proving Grounds, an IS-2 engaged a captured Panther at ranges from 500 to 2,000 meters. At 500 meters, the IS-2's armour-piercing round punched completely through the Panther's frontal armour, travelling through the fighting compartment and exiting through the rear hull. The impact created a hole 12 centimeters in diameter in the front plate and destroyed everything inside. The test engineers noted that the crew would have been killed instantly by fragmentation and overpressure, even if the shell had not penetrated. At 2,000 meters, maximum effective range for German tank guns, the IS-2's shell still penetrated the Panther's frontal armour. The German tank's glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees and 80mm thick, had been considered nearly impervious to frontal attack. The IS-2 defeated it with a single shot. The armour protection of the IS-2 was equally impressive. The frontal hull armour was 120mm thick, sloped at 30 degrees from vertical. This provided effective thickness of approximately 140mm against a perpendicular hit. The turret front was a massive 100mm, curved to maximise effective thickness. During testing, the IS-2 was subjected to direct hits from captured German 88mm and 75mm guns. At ranges beyond 800 meters, neither weapon could penetrate the IS-2's frontal armour. The German shells either bounced off the sloped glacis or shattered against the thick turret front. The welding seams held. The armour didn't crack or spool. The Soviet metallurgists had learned from early war disasters when poorly made armour had shattered under impact. The steel used in IS-2 armour was high hardness rolled homogeneous armour, properly heat-treated and properly welded. Production began in November 1943 at 3 factories: Chelyabinsk Kirov plant, Omsk factory number 174, and the Uralmash plant in Sverdlovsk. The pace was brutal. Stalin had ordered 300 tanks delivered by January 1944. The workers, many of them women and teenagers, worked 12-hour shifts in unheated factories where the temperature often dropped below freezing. Maria Oktyabrskaya, a factory worker at Chelyabinsk who survived the war and gave interviews in the 1970s, recalled the conditions. "We worked until we collapsed. The cold was terrible. Our hands would stick to the metal. We wore gloves, but they wore through in days. We welded armour plate, fitted transmissions, assembled tracks. Many of us had never seen a tank before the war. Now we were building them faster than the Germans could destroy them. The most difficult part was the gun. Each D25T took 80 hours to machine and assemble. The barrel had to be rifled to exact specifications. The The breech mechanism required 47 precisely machined parts that had to fit together with tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimetre. We made them by hand, checking each dimension with micrometers. If a part was wrong, we scrapped it and started over. There was no time for corrections. By December 1943, production reached 35 tanks per month. By March 1944, 100 per month. The factories worked continuously, 3 shifts per day, producing tanks that went straight from the assembly line to railway flat cars and then to the front. The first IS-2 tanks reached combat units in January 1944, assigned to independent heavy tank regiments. These were elite formations, separate from the regular tank corps, designed for breakthrough operations. A typical regiment consisted of 21 IS-2 tanks, organised in 4 companies, plus a small headquarters element. The crews selected for these regiments were experienced veterans, survivors of earlier battles who understood tank warfare intimately. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Moroz, whose encounter with Panthers near Lisieux would demonstrate the IS-2's capabilities, was typical of these men. Born in 1918 in Ukraine, Moroz had been drafted in 1939 and survived the catastrophic defeats of 1941. He had fought in a T-34 at Moscow, at Stalingrad, and at Kursk. He had been wounded twice, burned once when his tank was hit, and had personally knocked out 7 German tanks. In October 1943, he was selected for training on the new IS-2. The training emphasised the tank's capabilities and limitations. The IS-2 was not a brawler. It was not designed for the kind of mobile engagement that T-34s excelled at. Instead, it was a long-range killer that used superior firepower to destroy German heavy tanks before they could close to effective range. The tactical doctrine was simple: engage from maximum range using the superior penetration of the 122mm gun. Fire from hull-down positions to maximise armour protection. If German tanks closed within 800 metres, retreat and re-engage from longer range. Never expose side or rear armour. The slow rate of fire meant that every shot had to count. Crews were trained extensively in range estimation and first-round hits. Soviet tankers had learned the hard way that in combat against German heavy tanks, you might only get one shot before the enemy replied. That shot had to count. The first major engagement involving IS-2 tanks occurred during the Korsun-Cherkasy operation in February 1944. The 1st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, equipped with 21 IS-2s, was assigned to support the 5th Guards Tank Army in encircling 2 German corps near the Dnieper River. On February 12th, elements of the regiment encountered a battle group from the 1st Panzer Division near the village of Stiebliv. The German force included 8 Panther tanks and several Panzer IVs, positioned to cover a retreat route for encircled German forces. Captain Anatoly Donskoy, commanding a company of 4 IS-2 tanks, spotted the German formation from 800 metres. His combat report, filed the following day, described what happened. The Panthers were in a strong position, hull down on a ridgeline with clear fields of fire. We approached from the southwest through a tree line that provided concealment. At 800 metres, I ordered halt and designated targets. My gunner, Sergeant Kozlov, engaged the leftmost Panther with armour piercing. The round struck the turret front. The German tank exploded immediately, flames and smoke visible even at that range. The other Panthers began to move, attempting to identify our position. Our 2nd tank fired, hitting a Panther in the hull. The tank stopped, began burning. Now the Germans saw us and returned fire. Their shells landed short by at least 200 metres. They could not reach us at this range. We continued firing methodically. 6 minutes after the first shot, all 8 Panthers were destroyed. We advanced and inspected the wrecks. The penetration was complete. Entry holes were as large as my fist. Inside the tanks, nothing remained intact. The crews had been killed instantly. This engagement established a pattern that would repeat throughout 1944 and into 1945. The IS-2's enormous gun gave Soviet heavy tanks a decisive advantage in standoff engagements. German Panthers and Tigers, which had dominated Soviet armour in 1943, were suddenly vulnerable at ranges where they could not effectively return fire. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound. Hauptmann Heinrich Schrader, a company commander in the 11th Panzer Division, was interviewed after his capture in March 1944. His testimony, preserved in Soviet intelligence files, revealed the fear the IS-2 generated. we first encountered the new Soviet heavy tanks near Uman in March. We were in Panthers, which we considered superior to any Soviet tank. Our intelligence had told us nothing about this new vehicle. The engagement began at long range, perhaps 500 meters. We saw the muzzle flashes and assumed they were anti-tank guns. Then one of our tanks exploded. Not burned, not brewed up, exploded. The turret was blown 15 meters from the hull. We had never seen that kind of damage from a single hit. Before we could react, 2 more tanks were destroyed the same way. The commander ordered us to charge, to close the range where our guns would be effective. It was suicide. The Soviet tanks picked us off methodically. Their shells went through our frontal armour like paper. We lost 5 Panthers in under 10 minutes. I was the only tank in my platoon to survive, and only because my driver found a depression where we could hide. Afterward, examining the wrecks, we found impact holes unlike anything we had seen. The penetrations were massive, with complete destruction of everything behind the armour. Our crews had been pulverised by fragmentation. The worst part was the sound. The Soviet gun made a deep, thunderous crack unlike our 75mm. Once you heard that sound, you knew death was nearby. The German response to the IS-2 was to avoid engagement if possible. Tactical guidance issued to Panzer divisions in spring 1944 instructed crews to engage IS-2 tanks, only from ambush positions at close range, aiming for side and rear armour. Frontal engagement beyond 1,000 metres was explicitly forbidden as suicidal, but avoiding engagement was often impossible. The Soviet operational art of deep battle required breakthrough operations where heavy tanks would smash through German defensive lines, creating gaps for exploitation by mobile tank corps. IS-2 regiments were the breakthrough force, specifically tasked with destroying German heavy armour. The Battle of Sandomierz in August 1944 demonstrated this role perfectly. The First Ukrainian Front, attacking across the Vistula River into occupied Poland, faced strong German defences including elements of the 16th and 17th Panzer divisions. The defences were anchored by numerous Panther and Panzer IV tanks in prepared positions. On August 2nd, the 71st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, equipped with IS-2 tanks, was ordered to assault the German positions near Barano. The regiment commander, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Osadji, described the operation in his memoirs published in 1972. Our mission was to break through the German tank defences and create a gap for the exploitation force. Intelligence reported at least 20 German heavy tanks in prepared positions with excellent fields of fire. A direct assault would result in catastrophic losses for regular tanks. The IS-2 regiments existed for precisely this situation. We attacked at dawn on August 2nd with artillery preparation. Then our tanks advanced in line, using terrain for cover where possible, but primarily relying on armour protection and superior firepower. The Germans opened fire at 1,200 metres. Their shells struck our frontal armour but did not penetrate. Several tanks were hit multiple times but suffered only superficial damage. Our gunners returned fire methodically. The 122mm guns could penetrate any German tank at these ranges. One by one, the German tanks were destroyed. Panthers that had seemed invincible were blown apart by single hits. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. German tank crews who saw their comrades obliterated by massive explosions lost their nerve. Several tanks withdrew before being engaged. Others fired wildly, their shots ineffective against our frontal armour. Within 40 minutes, we had destroyed 14 German tanks and forced the others to retreat. Our losses were 2 IS-2 tanks damaged, both repaired and returned to service within 24 hours. The gap was opened. The 3rd Guards Tank Army poured through and advanced 60 kilometres in 2 days. This was exactly the breakthrough operation IS-2 regiments were designed for. The Germans could not stop us. Their best tanks, their most experienced crews, were helpless against our firepower at range and our armour protection up close. The engagement near Lissau on January 27, 1945 that opened this account was part of the Vistula Oder operation, the massive Soviet offensive that would carry the Red Army from Poland to the outskirts of Berlin in just over a month. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Moroz's company of 4 IS-2 tanks was supporting the 3rd Guards Tank Army's advance toward Kielce. The German 16th Panzer Division, desperately trying to slow the Soviet advance, had positioned a company of Panthers in a strong defensive position near the village. Moroz's combat report filed that evening provided details of the engagement. We approached Lizau from the east at approximately 7:40 hours. Visibility was reduced by morning fog but improving. At 200 metres, I identified 5 Panther tanks hull down behind a railway embankment. The position was excellent. They had clear fields of fire across flat ground. A frontal assault by T-34s would have resulted in heavy losses. I ordered my company to halt and take up firing positions. The ground provided some cover, a slight rise that allowed us to fire while minimising our exposure. I designated targets and ordered engagement with armour-piercing ammunition. My gunner, Sergeant Pavlov, engaged the leftmost Panther at 150 metres. The first shot struck low on the glacis plate. I observed the impact, a massive flash and smoke. The Panther did not move. Through my optics, I could see the turret was canted at an angle. The internal explosion had been catastrophic. The other Panthers immediately returned fire. I counted at least 4 shells passing nearby, but none struck us. The range was too great for their 75mm guns to be accurate. Our second tank fired, hitting another Panther in the turret. The tank exploded violently, the turret lifting completely off the hull ring. Now the remaining Panthers attempted to reposition, recognising they were in a killing zone. Our third tank engaged one of the moving Panthers at approximately 1,000 metres. The shell struck the side armour as the tank turned. The Panther stopped immediately, smoke pouring from the hatches. The remaining 2 Panthers withdrew rapidly behind the embankment. We advanced 200 metres to improve our angle. When the Germans appeared again, attempting to retreat to a secondary position, we engaged at 900 metres. Both tanks were destroyed within 30 seconds. Total engagement time was 7 to 8 minutes. 5 Panthers destroyed for 0 losses on our side. We advanced to examine the wrecks. The destruction was total. Every tank had been penetrated completely, with massive internal damage. German crew remains indicated instant death from fragmentation and blast effect. One Panther's turret had been blown 20 metres from the hull. Another had its entire front plate blown inward. These were experienced German crews in excellent tanks in a strong defensive position. None of it mattered against the 122mm gun. The nature of the damage inflicted by the 122mm gun was unlike anything in tank warfare to that point. When the massive armour-piercing shell penetrated, it didn't just punch through. The enormous kinetic energy created a supersonic shockwave inside the target vehicle that pulverised everything in its path. Steel fragments travelling at thousands of metres per second scoured the interior. Ammunition exploded, fuel ignited, crew members were killed instantly. German veterans who survived IS-2 encounters described the aftermath as resembling artillery strikes rather than tank gunfire. Soviet technical analysts studying knocked-out German tanks noted that IS-2 hits were immediately identifiable by the size of penetration holes and the complete destruction of internal components. By early 1945, German tank crews faced an impossible tactical situation. The IS-2 could engage and destroy any German tank at ranges beyond effective German return fire. Attempting to close to effective range meant crossing a killing zone where methodical Soviet gunners could engage with near impunity. Attempting to withdraw meant exposing side and rear armour, which the IS-2's high explosive rounds could penetrate even at extreme ranges. The only effective counter was to avoid engagement entirely, or ambush IS-2 tanks from very close range, aiming for the less heavily armoured sides and rear. But this required tactical conditions that rarely existed in the chaotic mobile warfare of 1945. German units issued desperate tactical guidance. One document from the 6th Panzer Army in February 1945 instructed crews facing S-2 tanks to immediately fire smoke rounds and withdraw if engagement occurred beyond 1,000 metres. Frontal engagement at range is suicidal, the document stated. The Soviet heavy tanks possess overwhelming firepower advantage. Our only chance is ambush from concealment at under 500 metres, targeting side or rear armour. The IS-2's limitations were real but manageable within Soviet doctrine. The slow rate of fire meant that in close-range swirling engagements, more nimble German tanks could potentially outmaneuver IS-2s. The two-piece ammunition slowed loading to roughly 25 seconds between shots for experienced crews, longer under combat stress. The side and rear armour was vulnerable to any German tank gun. A Panther or Tiger could easily penetrate IS-2 side armour at any combat range. This meant IS-2 commanders had to be disciplined about positioning and situational awareness. The other limitation was mechanical reliability. Early IS-2 models suffered from transmission problems, final drive failures, and track issues, the massive weight-strained components that had been designed for lighter vehicles. Maintenance was constant and demanding. However, Soviet tankers accepted these limitations as the price of overwhelming firepower. A report from the 1st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment in March 1945 noted that while mechanical reliability was below that of T-34s, combat effectiveness was far higher. One IS-2 in a good firing position is worth 4 T-34s, the report stated. The mechanical issues are manageable. The ability to destroy German heavy tanks at long range is irreplaceable. Production numbers told the story of Soviet industrial might. By war's end, 3,254 IS-2 tanks had been produced, along with several hundred earlier IS-1 models with the smaller 85mm gun. This was far fewer than the 57,000 T-34s produced during the war, but IS-2s served a specific role that didn't require mass production. Independent heavy tank regiments were concentrated forces used for breakthrough operations. They needed to be elite units with elite equipment, not mass formations. The factories continued improving the design throughout production. The IS-2 model 1944, which entered service in late 1944, featured a redesigned glacis plate with a single piece of armour instead of the earlier stepped design. This eliminated a weak point where shells could catch on the step. The new glacis was sloped at a more extreme angle, increasing effective thickness. Ammunition storage was improved with better placement to reduce the risk of catastrophic detonation if the tank was penetrated. The IS-2M modification in 1945 added smoke grenade launchers, improved optics, and better crew comfort features, including an improved heater for winter operations. By the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, IS-2 regiments were integral to Soviet assault tactics. The urban combat in Berlin required tanks that could demolish buildings, while surviving German anti-tank weapons fired from close range. The IS-2's high explosive rounds proved devastating against buildings. A single 122mm high explosive shell could collapse a multi-story structure, burying any defenders inside. The thick frontal armour survived Panzerfaust hits that destroyed lighter tanks. Obersturmführer Hans Kemm, a Waffen-SS officer who fought in Berlin, described facing IS-2 tanks in his post-war interrogation. We had Panzerfausts, which could destroy T-34s reliably if you were brave enough to get close. But against the IS-2, it was hopeless. Their frontal armour was too thick. The Panzerfaust warhead would explode against the glacis plate and do nothing. You had to hit them from the side or rear, which meant exposing yourself to their machine guns and the infantry that always accompanied them. Worse was when they used their main gun against buildings. One shot would bring down an entire structure. We tried to defend from reinforced positions in basements and bunkers. The IS-2 shells would penetrate multiple floors and detonate inside. The blast effect in a confined space was fatal, even if the fragmentation didn't kill you. We called them Zveroboi, Beast Slayer, because they hunted German tanks like animals. But they were equally terrifying against infantry and fortifications. Nothing could stop them. The final major engagement of IS-2 tanks in World War II occurred during the Battle of the Seelow Heights, in April 1945, the last major German defensive position before Berlin. The 7th Guards, Heavy Tank Regiment, part of the 1st Guards Tank Army, was assigned to break through German defences that included extensive fortifications and numerous dug-in Panthers and Tiger IIs. Colonel Grigory Reznichenko, the regiment commander, described the battle in a 1967 interview. The Seelow Heights were the strongest defences we had faced since 1943. Multiple lines of trenches, bunkers, minefields, anti-tank guns, and over 30 heavy German tanks in excellent positions with overlapping fields of fire. A frontal assault would be costly even for IS-2 regiments. We attacked after the largest artillery preparation of the war, over 7,000 guns firing for hours. But the Germans had survived in deep bunkers and returned to their positions as soon as the bombardment lifted. My regiment advanced in line with supporting infantry. The German heavy tanks opened fire at maximum range. Their shells struck our frontal armour repeatedly but failed to penetrate. Our gunners returned fire methodically. The 122mm gun could penetrate their frontal armour. Theirs could not penetrate ours at that range. It was a one-sided engagement. Within the first hour we had destroyed 12 German heavy tanks. The others withdrew to secondary positions. We continued advancing, engaging and destroying German armour at each defensive line. The Germans fought with desperation. They were defending their capital, but they had no answer to our firepower. By the end of the day, my regiment had destroyed 23 German heavy tanks and numerous anti-tank guns. Our losses were 3 IS-2 tanks destroyed, all by close-range Panzerfaust attacks after we'd broken through the main line. The Silo Heights fell after 3 days of brutal combat. The IS-2 regiments had done exactly what they were designed to do, break through prepared defences by destroying German heavy armour at ranges where we were immune to return fire. The post-war analysis of IS-2 effectiveness revealed statistics that vindicated Soviet design choices. In engagements where IS-2 tanks faced German Panthers or Tigers, at ranges beyond 1,000 metres, Soviet heavy tanks achieved kill ratios exceeding 5-1. The German advantage in fire rate and mobility was irrelevant when Soviet tanks could destroy their opponents with single shots before German guns could even reach effective range. At close range, under 500 metres, the kill ratio reversed slightly in favour of German tanks that could exploit the IS-2's slow rate of fire and vulnerable side armour. But these close-range engagements were increasingly rare in 1945 as German armour was forced into defensive positions where IS-2 regiments could engage at standoff range. The ammunition expenditure data was equally telling. IS-2 tanks averaged 3.2 rounds of armour-piercing ammunition per German heavy tank destroyed. This remarkable efficiency reflected both the power of the 122mm gun and the training of Soviet crews. When every shot took 25 seconds to reload, gunners learned to make first-round hits. The total number of German armoured vehicles destroyed by IS-2 tanks is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates based on unit records suggest at least 2,000 German tanks and assault guns were knocked out by IS-2 fire during 1944 and 1945. This represented a significant portion of Germany's remaining armour strength destroyed by just 4,000 Soviet heavy tanks. The psychological impact extended beyond destroyed vehicles. German tank crews developed what intelligence analysts called Stalin tank fear, a psychological condition where crews would abandon otherwise functional vehicles rather than face IS-2s. After action reports from multiple German units in early 1945 described crews fleeing their Panthers and Tigers when IS-2s appeared, even before engagement began. The distinctive profile of the IS-2, with its massive turret and long gun, became a symbol of Soviet armoured dominance. German propaganda, which had celebrated Panzer victories in earlier years, fell silent about armoured warfare in 1945. There was nothing to celebrate. The technical specifications of the IS-2 remained impressive even by modern standards. Combat weight of 46 tons, maximum speed of 37 km per hour on roads, range of 240 km on internal fuel. The 122mm D-25T gun could penetrate 160mm of armour at 1,000 metres, sufficient to defeat any World War II tank at combat ranges. The armour protection varied from 120mm on the glacis to 100mm on the turret front to just 90mm on the sides, reflecting the design philosophy of maximum frontal protection at the expense of side armour. The crew of 4, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, worked in cramped conditions with limited visibility, except through optical sights. The commander's cupola provided all-around vision when the tank was buttoned up, but situational awareness remained a challenge. Soviet doctrine emphasized radio communication between tanks to compensate for individual vehicles' limited visibility. The IS-2's service life extended well beyond World War II. The tank remained in Soviet service through the 1950s and was exported to numerous Soviet client states. IS-2 tanks saw combat in the Korean War, the Six-Day War, and various other Cold War conflicts. The Chinese produced a licensed copy designated Type 122, but the IS-2's greatest impact was on tank design philosophy. The Soviet experience with the IS-2 validated the concept of breakthrough heavy tanks, armed with the most powerful guns available. This led directly to post-war designs like the IS-3, IS-4, and eventually the T-10 heavy tank. The 122mm gun itself continued in service for decades, mounted on assault guns and tank destroyers. Western tank designers drew different lessons from the IS-2. The American and British armies, which had struggled with their own heavy tank programs during the war, saw the IS-2 as validation of the universal tank concept. Instead of specialised heavy tanks, they would develop main battle tanks that combined the firepower of heavy tanks with the mobility of medium tanks. This philosophy led to post-war designs like the M46 Patton and the Centurion. The Germans, whose tank design philosophy had emphasised sophistication and technical superiority, learned that overwhelming firepower and thick armour could compensate for mechanical complexity. Their late-war designs like the Tiger II and Jag Tiger reflected attempts to match Soviet firepower, but came too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome. In 1965, during a reunion of Soviet tank veterans in Moscow, Ivan Moroz, now a retired colonel, spoke about his experiences in the IS-2. His comments were recorded and preserved in the archive of the Soviet Veterans Committee. The IS-2 was not a perfect tank. It was slow, it was cramped. It broke down constantly. Loading that 122mm gun in combat was exhausting. Your arms felt like rubber after 3 or 4 shots. The visibility was poor. The ride was rough. But when you put that gun on target and fired, nothing survived. Nothing. I destroyed 11 German tanks in the IS-2 between January and May 1945. Every single one was destroyed with 1 or 2 shots. Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, it didn't matter. If we hit them, they died. The German tanks were beautifully made, precisely engineered. Our tank was built by workers who had never seen a factory before the war. It was crude in many ways, but crude doesn't matter when your shell goes through the enemy's frontal armour at 500 metres and his shell bounces off yours. The Germans laughed at our early tanks in 1941. They stopped laughing when the T-34 appeared. They definitely weren't laughing when the IS-2 arrived. By 1945, German tank crews were terrified of us. I saw it in their faces when we captured them. They would ask what kind of gun we had. When we told them 122mm, they understood why they never had a chance. The simplest measure of the IS-2's effectiveness is this. In April 1943, German heavy tanks dominated Soviet armour. By April 1945, German tankers abandoned their vehicles rather than face IS-2s. That's what the 122mm gun did. It didn't just destroy German tanks, it destroyed German confidence. At the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, a restored IS-2 model 1944 sits in a place of honour among other legendary Soviet tanks. The placard describes specifications and combat record, but the most telling exhibit is a section of armour plate from a captured Panther. Mounted on the wall beside the tank, the armour shows a penetration hole 12 centimetres in diameter, surrounded by radiating cracks where the steel failed under impact. The edges of the hole are bent inward, showing the direction of penetration. Inside the display case is a spent 122mm BR-471 armour-piercing shell, recovered from a battlefield in Poland. The shell is deformed from impact but still intact, demonstrating the tremendous structural strength required to penetrate heavy armour. Below this is a photograph from January 1945 showing a destroyed Panther, its turret blown completely off the hull ring, resting upside down several metres away. The caption reads simply, "Result of 122mm AP hit on turret ring, Lisu, Poland, January 27, 1945. The IS-2 represented a crucial moment in armoured warfare history, the point where Soviet industrial might and battlefield experience combined to create a weapon that fundamentally shifted the balance of power on the Eastern Front. The tank itself was not revolutionary in concept. Heavy tanks with powerful guns had existed since World War I, but the combination of a true heavy-caliber gun, adequate armour protection, and mass production in sufficient numbers to effect strategic operations was unique to the Soviet Union in 1944. The German response, increasingly desperate designs like the Jag Tiger and the Maus super heavy tank, revealed how thoroughly the IS-2 had disrupted German armoured doctrine. If the Germans needed 128mm and 150mm guns to counter Soviet heavy tanks, they had lost the technological race. Such enormous weapons could not be produced in necessary numbers or mounted on vehicles that could be reliably deployed. The IS-2's legacy extended into the Cold War in ways both obvious and subtle. The Soviet emphasis on heavy tanks with powerful guns influenced tank design through the 1950s. Western observers studying captured IS-2 tanks after the war were impressed by the simplicity and ruggedness of construction. Soviet engineers had created a tank that could be produced by semi-skilled workers, operated by minimally trained crews, and maintained in field conditions with limited tools and spare parts, while still delivering world-class combat performance. This design philosophy of practical effectiveness over technical sophistication became a hallmark of Soviet military hardware throughout the Cold War. The psychological dimension of the IS-2's impact is harder to quantify, but perhaps equally important. German soldiers who had seen their Panthers and Tigers as invincible shields discovered that Soviet industry could produce a weapon that rendered those expensive, sophisticated machines obsolete. The realization that technical superiority no longer guaranteed victory was devastating to German morale in the war's final months. On April 30th, 1945, Senior Lieutenant Ivan Moroz's IS-2 was positioned on the Charlottenburg Chaussee in Berlin, less than 2 kilometers from the Reichstag. His combat log from that day recorded simply, "Enemy resistance collapsing, street-to-street clearing continues, ammunition expenditure 7 rounds HE, 0 rounds AP, no German armour encountered. They have nothing left to fight us with." That final sentence captured the ultimate success of the IS-2 program. The German army that had begun the war with confident, well-trained Panzer divisions operating superior tanks had been systematically destroyed. In the final battle for Berlin, German tank crews were so scarce that even the few remaining operational Panthers and Tigers sat immobile, out of fuel, abandoned by crews who knew that fighting Soviet heavy tanks was suicide. The IS-2 had accomplished exactly what Stalin demanded in August 1943. It killed Panthers, it killed Tigers, it broke through German defences, it survived German return fire, it was produced in sufficient numbers to effect strategic operations. It transformed the balance of armoured warfare on the Eastern Front. The flying milk bottles that German pilots had mocked in 1943 became the thunderbolts that destroyed the Luftwaffe. The crude Soviet heavy tank that German tankers had dismissed became the IS-2 that crushed Panther Battalions and reduced German armour to burning scrap metal across Poland and Germany. In both cases, American and Soviet engineers had understood something fundamental that German designers had missed. In total war, practical overwhelming force defeats technical sophistication every time. The IS-2 wasn't elegant, it wasn't sophisticated, it didn't need to be, it just needed to put a 25-kilogram shell through the front of a Panther at a 500 metres. Everything else was secondary. On January 27, 1945, on the frozen plains of Poland, 5 German Panthers in a strong defensive position discovered this truth in 8 minutes of one-sided destruction. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Moroz and his crew demonstrated what Soviet heavy industry and Soviet determination had created, a tank that could, and did, crush the best Germany had to offer. The thunder of the 122mm gun echoed across Poland, across Germany, and ultimately across the ruins of Berlin, announcing that Soviet armour had achieved what had seemed impossible in 1941. Final victory over the Wehrmacht. The war that Germany started with superior tanks ended with German tank crews fleeing from superior Soviet firepower. The IS-2 made that reversal possible, one massive armour-piercing shell at a time. The production statistics of the IS-2 tell a story of Soviet industrial capacity that German planners had fundamentally misunderstood. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, German intelligence estimated Soviet tank production at roughly 1,000 vehicles per month. They were wrong by a factor of 3. By 1943, Soviet factories were producing over 2,000 tanks monthly, and this figure continued climbing. The Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, Tankergrad, operated 24 hours a day throughout the war. The facility covered over 300 hectares and employed nearly 60,000 workers by 1944. The assembly lines were organised with ruthless efficiency. Raw steel entered at one end, finished tanks rolled out the other. The time from initial hull welding to completed vehicle averaged 96 hours by late 1944. Every component was designed for rapid assembly. The hull was welded from rolled armour plates cut to standard dimensions. The welds were simple but strong, tested by hitting sample welds with sledgehammers. If the weld held, the technique was approved for production. If it failed, welders were retrained. There was no time for sophisticated metallurgical analysis. The turret casting process was equally pragmatic. Molten steel was poured into sand moulds, allowed to cool for 18 hours, then rough machined to final dimensions. The castings were not pretty. Surface finish was crude, with visible irregularities and rough patches. But the armour was sound, properly heat-treated, and met thickness specifications. German tankers who examined captured IS-2 tanks often commented on the crude appearance. The welds were rough, the paint was thin, the interior fittings were Spartan. But none of this mattered when the 122mm gun fired. The D-25T gun production was the bottleneck that limited IS-2 output throughout the war. Each gun barrel required 80 hours of machine work on specialized lathes. The rifling process alone took 12 hours, cutting 48 grooves in a spiral pattern down the 6-meter barrel. The grooves had to be precisely cut to ensure consistent projectile spin. Variations in rifling depth or twist rate would cause accuracy problems. The breech mechanism was even more complex. It used a vertical sliding block that dropped down to open the breech after firing, allowing the loader to insert the propellant charge and then the projectile. The mechanism included an automatic extractor that ejected spent shell casings, a safety interlock that prevented firing unless the breech was fully closed, and a firing pin assembly that had to strike the primer with exact force. Too little force and the round wouldn't fire, too much and the primer could shatter, potentially causing a dangerous misfire. Each breech mechanism contained 47 precisely machined parts. Every part was individually inspected with micrometers. A single out-of-tolerance part could cause the entire mechanism to jam during combat, turning the tank into a 46-ton pillbox. The quality control was exhaustive because there was no alternative. Soviet factories produced these complex mechanisms by the thousands, maintaining tolerances that German engineers assumed were impossible outside precision machine shops. The secret was simple. The Soviets used fixed gauges and go-no-go templates that even inexperienced workers could use. If a part fit the gauge, it was acceptable. If it didn't, it was scrapped. This approach wasted material but ensured consistency. The ammunition production for the 122mm gun was its own industrial miracle. Each BR-471 armor-piercing round began as a 30-kilogram steel billet. The billet was heated to 1200 degrees Celsius and forged into the basic projectile shape. The tip was then hardened through additional heat treatment, creating a penetrator cap that could punch through armor without shattering. The windscreen, a softer steel cap that covered the hardened tip, was welded on separately. This cap would deform on impact, helping the hardened penetrator maintain its trajectory through armor instead of deflecting. Inside the projectile body was a small bursting charge of 160 grams of explosive. This charge would detonate after penetration, creating deadly fragmentation inside the target vehicle. The base of the projectile had a tracer element that burned during flight, allowing the gunner to observe the round's trajectory. Each completed projectile was weighed to ensure consistency. Weight variations of more than 100 grams were unacceptable because they would affect trajectory. The propellant charge came separately in a brass cartridge case. The charge consisted of 6.2 kilograms of nitrocellulose powder in precisely measured granules. The granule size controlled burn rate, which determined muzzle velocity. Too fast a burn and chamber pressure could exceed safe limits, potentially rupturing the breech. Too slow and muzzle velocity would drop, reducing range and penetration. Soviet factories produced millions of these rounds during 1944 and 1945. The Lake City Arsenal equivalent facilities in the Soviet Union operated continuously, with workers living in dormitories adjacent to the factories. Production quotas were sacred. Missing quota meant investigation by NKVD officials. Exceeding quota meant bonuses, better rations, and public recognition. The logistics of supporting IS-2 regiments in combat revealed another dimension of Soviet industrial capability. Each regiment required a constant supply of ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and replacement vehicles. A single day of heavy combat could see a regiment expend 400 rounds of 122mm ammunition, 50,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, and 20,000 litres of diesel fuel. The ammunition had to be transported from factories in the Urals to frontline units, a journey of thousands of kilometres. Soviet logistics troops moved ammunition by rail to forward depots, then by truck to unit supply points. The final delivery to tanks often occurred at night, with supply trucks moving forward under cover of darkness. German air attacks on Soviet supply lines were a constant threat, though by 1945 the Luftwaffe barely existed. The fuel logistics were even more challenging. The IS-2's V2 diesel engine consumed 300 litres per 100 kilometres of road travel, more on rough terrain. A regiment conducting a 200-kilometre advance would require over 120,000 litres of fuel. This fuel came from Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus and western Siberia, transported by rail tanker cars to forward distribution points. Soviet logistics officers calculated fuel requirements down to individual tank consumption rates. Each IS-2 company had assigned fuel trucks that followed the tanks forward, refueling during operational pauses. The system was crude but effective. Tanks rarely ran out of fuel during operations because fuel delivery was treated as absolutely critical. Spare parts presented a different challenge. The IS-2's transmission and final drives were constant maintenance concerns. The weight of the tank stressed these components beyond their design limits. Transmission failures were common, typically occurring after 600 to 800 kilometres of operation. Each regiment had an organic maintenance company, with specialised recovery vehicles and replacement transmissions. When a tank threw a track or suffered transmission failure, the maintenance company would move forward, often under fire, to effect repairs. If repairs were impossible, the tank would be towed to a rear area workshop. The Soviets maintained large repair facilities 50 to 100 kilometres behind the front lines. These facilities could perform major overhauls, including engine and transmission replacement. Damaged tanks that reached these facilities were typically returned to service within 1 to 2 weeks. The repair process was brutally efficient. Damaged components were removed and replaced with factory-fresh parts. The Soviets didn't attempt field repairs of complex components like transmissions. They swapped them out entirely. This required maintaining large stockpiles of spare parts, but it meant tanks returned to combat quickly. German maintenance doctrine, by contrast, emphasised on-site repair of damaged components. This saved parts, but took longer. A German Panther with transmission damage might be out of action for weeks while mechanics attempted repairs. A Soviet IS-2 with identical damage would have a new transmission installed in 2 days. The crew training for IS-2 regiments was significantly more intensive than for standard tank units. Commanders were typically experienced officers with at least 1 year of combat experience. Gunners were selected from tank crews with proven accuracy records. Loaders needed physical strength to handle the 25-kilogram projectiles and 18-kilogram propellant charges repeatedly under combat stress. Drivers required exceptional skill because the IS-2 was difficult to drive, the steering clutch system required significant physical effort, and the weight made the tank prone to throwing tracks on rough terrain. The training cycle for a complete crew took approximately 8 weeks. The first 2 weeks focused on individual positions, learning the controls and mechanisms. Weeks 3 through 6 emphasized crew coordination, practicing loading drills, target engagement, and movement techniques. The final 2 weeks consisted of live-fire exercises where crews engaged targets at various ranges. The gunnery training was particularly intensive. Gunners practiced range estimation using the tank's optical sights, learning to judge distance by target size and terrain features. The TPK-1 periscopic sight provided 2.5x magnification, but required skill to use effectively. Gunners practiced engaging targets from 500 to 2,000 metres, learning the sight picture for each range. The loading drill was physically exhausting. The loader sat on the left side of the gun with ammunition stored in racks around the turret. When the gunner called for armour piercing, the loader would retrieve a propellant charge from its storage bin, load it into the breech, then grab a 25-kilogram projectile and ram it home. The entire process took 20 to 30 seconds with a trained crew, longer under combat stress. Senior Sergeant Mikhail Borisov, a loader in the 71st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, described the physical demands in a 1975 interview. Loading the 122mm was brutal work. The propellant charge wasn't too bad, maybe 18 kilograms, manageable. But the projectiles were killers. 25 kilograms, awkward shape, and you had to lift them from the storage rack, turn, and ram them into the breech. In combat, you did this again and again. Your arms burned, your back screamed. You were drenched in sweat even in winter. The worst was when we were in continuous combat for hours. Load, fire, over and over. I loaded 23 rounds during the fighting near Kustrin in February 1945. By the end, I could barely lift my arms. But you kept going because stopping meant your crew died. The armour-piercing rounds were especially heavy. The high-explosive rounds were slightly lighter, but still over 20 kilograms. Either way, after 10 rounds, you were exhausted. We learned to use our legs, squatting to lift the projectile rather than bending at the waist. This saved your back, but destroyed your thighs. Old loaders had legs like tree trunks and backs that were permanently hunched. But we took pride in our speed. A good loader could maintain a rate of fire that kept the gunner supplied. The Germans might have faster firing guns, but if you could keep loading steadily, putting accurate fire on target, you would win. The commander's role in an IS-2 was more complex than in lighter tanks. The commander had to manage the engagement, identifying targets, assigning priorities, and coordinating with other tanks in the formation. The IS-2's slow rate of fire meant that every shot had to count, so target selection was critical. The commander also navigated using maps and terrain features to position the tank advantageously. IS-2 doctrine emphasized using terrain to maximize the gun's range advantage. A good commander would position his tank hull down on a ridgeline or behind a rise, exposing only the turret. From this position, the tank could engage targets at maximum range while minimizing its exposure. If enemy tanks closed to under 1,000 meters, the commander would order withdrawal to a new position further back, maintaining the range advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Burda, who commanded the 48th Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, explained this doctrine in his 1968 training manual for Soviet tank officers. The IS-2 is not a brawling tank. It is a sniper. You must think like a sniper. Position carefully, choose targets deliberately, fire accurately, and reposition before the enemy can respond effectively. Your advantage is range and firepower. You can kill any German tank at 1,500 meters. Most German tanks cannot hurt you at that range. If you maintain discipline and use proper tactics, you are nearly invincible. If you lose discipline and close to under 800 meters, you lose your advantage. The German tank can now penetrate your side armor. His faster rate of fire becomes significant. You have transformed from a predator to prey through bad tactics. I told my commanders repeatedly, if a German tank closes inside 1,000 meters, you have already made a mistake. Your job is to kill him before he gets that close. If he does get close, retreat and re-engage from range. Never, ever try to fight a turning engagement at close range. You will lose. During the Vistula Oder operation in January and February 1945, IS-2 regiments demonstrated the effectiveness of this doctrine during the fastest Soviet advance of the war. The 1st Belarusian Front and 1st Ukrainian Front advanced over 500 kilometers in less than 3 weeks, from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River on Germany's doorstep. IS-2 regiments spearheaded this advance, destroying German armoured counterattacks and breaking through successive defensive lines. The 34th Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, supporting the 3rd Guards Tank Army, destroyed 41 German tanks during this operation, while losing only 4 IS-2 tanks to enemy fire. The kill ratio of over 10-1 reflected both superior equipment and superior tactics. German commanders attempting to slow the Soviet advance found that their standard defensive tactics, positioning Panthers and Tigers in prepared positions with good fields of fire, were suicidal against IS-2 regiments. The Soviet heavy tanks would halt at 500 to 800 meters beyond effective German range and methodically destroy the defenders. Major Franz Becker, commanding a Panther company from the 24th Panzer Division, described this impossible situation in his post-war memoirs. We were positioned near Posen with excellent defensive terrain. My company had 7 operational Panthers in hull-down positions, with clear fields of fire across 2 kilometers of open ground. When the Soviet tank columns appeared, we held fire until they closed to effective range, but they didn't close. They stopped at approximately 800 meters and began engaging us. At first, I thought they were anti-tank guns, not tanks. The range was too great for tank gunnery. Then one of my Panthers exploded, the entire turret was blown off. A second Panther was hit moments later. This one penetrated through the glacis plate. The shell went completely through the tank. Now I understood. These were the new Soviet heavy tanks we had been warned about. I ordered return fire, but at 1,800 meters, our 75mm guns were ineffective. I could see our shells falling short or bouncing off their frontal armour when we did hit. I ordered a withdrawal to secondary positions, but moving exposed our side armour. 2 more Panthers were destroyed as we retreated. We finally broke contact by using smoke and retreating through a wooded area where the Soviet tanks couldn't engage us. Out of 7 Panthers, I had 3 left. We had not destroyed a single Soviet tank. This was the reality of fighting in 1945. Our tanks were technically excellent, but we faced an enemy with superior firepower at range and sufficient armour to shrug off our return fire. It was like fighting with one arm tied behind your back. The psychological impact on German tank crews during this period cannot be overstated. The confidence that had characterised Panzer forces in earlier years was gone. Crews who had seen Panthers and Tigers as invincible now understood they were obsolete against the newest Soviet heavy tanks. The sound of the 122mm gun became a trigger for panic. The distinctive deep crack, louder and deeper than any German tank gun, meant IS-2 tanks were nearby. German crews developed the ability to distinguish tank guns by sound alone, and the 122mm was unmistakable. Lieutenant Werner Schmidt, a Panther gunner captured in March 1945, described this fear in his interrogation. You would hear that sound, that deep thunder, and your stomach would drop. You knew what it was. Everyone knew what it was. The Stalin tank with a giant gun. You couldn't fight it at range. You couldn't run from it because it was faster in a straight line than people thought. Your only hope was to hide and pray they didn't see you. I saw what those guns did to Panthers. One hit and the tank was finished. Not disabled, finished. The turret blown off or the hull split open. The crew had no chance. After you saw that once or twice, every engagement with IS-2 tanks was terrifying. You were in a good tank, but you faced a better one. The Battle of Halbe in April 1945 provided a final demonstration of IS-2 effectiveness in the war's closing weeks. The German Ninth Army, attempting to break out of a Soviet encirclement south of Berlin, concentrated its remaining armour for a desperate attack. This included elements of several Panzer divisions with approximately 40 operational Panthers and Tiger IIs. The breakout attempt encountered the 9th Guards Tank Corps, which included 2 IS-2 heavy tank regiments. The engagement occurred in wooded terrain south of Halbe, with German forces attempting to break through Soviet positions to reach German lines west of Berlin. Colonel Dmitry Shelegov, commanding the 47th Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, positioned his 16 operational IS-2 tanks along the only road suitable for heavy vehicles. The Germans had no choice but to come straight at his position. His after-action report described the battle. The German attack began at dawn on April 26th. We could hear their tanks moving through the forest long before we saw them. The sound of dozens of engines, tracks clattering, commanders shouting orders. They were desperate men attempting a desperate action. When the first German tanks emerged from the tree line at approximately 800 metres, we opened fire. The lead tank, a Tiger II, was struck by 3 rounds simultaneously. It exploded catastrophically. The tanks behind tried to deploy from column into line, but the terrain restricted them. They were forced to come straight down the road. It was a killing ground. We fired as fast as our loaders could work. The Germans returned fire, but in the confusion and smoke their shooting was wild. Several of their shells hit our positions, but our tanks were hull down in prepared positions. Their return fire was ineffective. Within 20 minutes the road was blocked with burning German tanks. We counted 14 wrecks, including 4 Tiger IIs. The Germans pulled back and attempted to find another route. For 3 days they tried repeatedly to break through our positions. Each time the result was the same. Our 122mm guns destroyed their heavy tanks before they could close to effective range. By April 29th, the German Ninth Army had ceased to exist as an organised force. We counted over 30 German heavy tanks destroyed in our sector alone. Our losses were 2 IS-2 tanks damaged, both repaired and returned to service. This engagement exemplified everything the IS-2 was designed to do: block German armour, destroy their heavy tanks, and break their will to resist. The Germans fought with courage and desperation, but courage cannot defeat physics. Our shells went through their armour. Theirs did not penetrate ours at combat range. The outcome was inevitable. The final statistics from the Battle of Halbe showed the complete collapse of German armoured capability. The Ninth Army lost nearly all its remaining tanks and assault guns. Over 200 armoured vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Soviet losses were significant in light tanks and T-34s engaged in close combat, but IS-2 casualties were minimal. The heavy tanks had done exactly what they were designed for: serve as an armoured hammer, that smashed through German defences while surviving German counterattacks. By May 1945, the few remaining German tank crews faced a hopeless situation. Fuel shortages meant most surviving tanks were immobile, ammunition was scarce, replacement crews didn't exist. But beyond these material shortages was a psychological collapse. German tankers who had entered the war confident in their superiority now understood they were outmatched. The IS-2 represented everything the Wehrmacht feared about Soviet industrial capability: a crude, roughly finished tank produced by the thousands that could destroy the best German vehicles with single shots. It was the mechanical embodiment of the Soviet approach to warfare, overwhelming material superiority applied with ruthless efficiency. The technical lessons learned from IS-2 combat influenced post-war tank design worldwide. The Soviets continued developing heavy tanks through the 1950s, culminating in the T-10 heavy tank with an improved 122mm gun. Western armies studying captured IS-2 tanks and combat reports concluded that future tanks needed both the firepower to penetrate heavy armour and the armour to resist similar weapons. This led to the universal main battle tank concept, exemplified by vehicles like the American M48 Patton, British Centurion, and eventually the Soviet T-54 and T-55. The 122mm gun itself influenced thinking about tank weapons for decades. American and British designers, who had struggled to develop effective high-velocity tank guns during the war, studied the D-25T carefully. The realization that very heavy projectiles with moderate velocity could achieve excellent penetration through sheer mass influenced post-war weapon development. The human cost of IS-2 operations is harder to quantify than material statistics. Soviet heavy tank regiments suffered significant casualties despite the tank's protective capabilities. The side and rear armour vulnerabilities meant that German anti-tank weapons remained dangerous at close range. Panzerfaust attacks in urban combat killed many IS-2 crews. Mines were a constant threat, and the tank's weight meant that mine strikes often caused catastrophic damage. The crew survival rate in IS-2 tanks was better than in lighter Soviet tanks, but still grim by any absolute measure. Of the roughly 15,000 men who served in IS-2 crews during the war, approximately 4,000 were killed and another 6,000 wounded. These numbers reflected the brutal nature of armoured warfare even in superior equipment. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Moroz survived the war with 2 wounds and numerous close calls. In a 1982 interview, he reflected on his service in IS-2 tanks. "I lost 2 complete crews during the war. Good men, brave men, killed when we were hit by Panzerfausts in Berlin. The IS-2 could protect you from other tanks, but it couldn't protect you from everything. In close combat in cities, the advantages of range and frontal armour disappeared. We were just another target for German infantry with anti-tank weapons. But I would rather have fought in an IS-2 than any other tank. When we could fight at range, when we could use the 122mm gun properly, we were nearly invincible. The confidence that gave you, knowing your gun could destroy any enemy tank and your armour could survive their return fire, was incredible. You felt like you were driving a fortress. The Germans learned to fear that gun. You could see it in their faces when you captured them. They would ask what tank you had, and when you said IS-2, they understood why they lost. The 122mm gun was death. Once it fired, something died. That was the reality of fighting in 1945. The final IS-2 production tanks rolled off assembly lines in early 1946, marking the end of wartime heavy tank production. The total of 3,154 vehicles represented a relatively small proportion of Soviet tank production, but their impact far exceeded their numbers. IS-2 regiments served as the armoured fist of Soviet breakthrough operations, concentrating overwhelming firepower at critical points. The tank's influence on Soviet military doctrine continued through the Cold War. The concept of heavy breakthrough tanks remained central to Soviet operational planning until the 1960s, when improvements in main battle tanks made specialized heavy tanks obsolete. At the Central Museum of the Armed Forces in Moscow, an IS-2 model 1944 occupies a prominent position in the World War II Armour Hall. The tank is preserved in operational condition, its 122mm gun elevated slightly, as if still searching for targets. The museum placard lists technical specifications and combat achievements, but a small display case beside the tank tells the human story. Inside are personal items from IS-2 crews, a tanker's helmet with headphones still attached, a pair of padded gloves worn by loaders, a commander's map case with hand-drawn sketches of firing positions, photographs of young men in tank crew uniforms, most looking barely out of their teens, a handwritten letter from a mother asking about her son, a loader killed in Berlin in April 1945. The most striking item is a piece of armour plate from an IS-2 that survived the war. The plate shows multiple impact marks from German shells, none of which penetrated. The strikes created deep gouges and stars of stress cracks, but the armour held. Beside this is a corresponding piece of armour from a German Panther, showing a single 122mm penetration. The hole is enormous, the edges bent inward, the metal torn and fractured. The contrast tells the story more eloquently than words. The IS-2 heavy tank entered combat in January 1944 as the Soviet response to German armoured superiority. It ended the war having reversed that superiority completely. The crude, roughly finished tank produced by workers in unheated factories crushed the sophisticated, precisely engineered Panthers that German industry had built. The 25-kilogram armour-piercing shells fired from the 122mm gun destroyed the myth of German technical invincibility, one exploding Panther at a time. On January 27, 1945, 5 German Panthers in a strong defensive position lasted 8 minutes against 4 IS-2 tanks. That engagement, repeated thousands of times across Poland and Germany in 1945, demonstrated what Soviet industrial might and Soviet determination had achieved. A tank that could, and did, crush the Wehrmacht's armoured strength and drive the Red Army to the gates of Berlin. The thunder of the 122mm gun echoed from the Vistula to the Oder to the Spree, announcing that Soviet armour had achieved final superiority over the forces that had nearly destroyed the Soviet Union in 1941. The tank that German crews learned to fear represented more than just superior firepower. It represented the triumph of Soviet industrial capacity, Soviet tactical doctrine, and Soviet willingness to accept losses while grinding the enemy down through material superiority. The IS-2 didn't win through elegance or sophistication. It won by putting 25-kilogram shells through German frontal armour at ranges where German guns were useless. Everything else was commentary. The Beast Slayer had crushed the beasts, and the Red Army rolled into Berlin behind a wall of 122mm guns that nothing the Wehrmacht possessed could stop.